We started this course in business, economy, and society by looking at even what an economy is. And then we went to looking toward economic thinkers of the past to see how the ideas of economics have evolved over the last couple of hundred years. We started with classical political economy. That's Adam Smith, back in the 18th century, coming up with the idea of markets that balance themselves and things like that. And we ended up going through time until we got to this thing called the marginalist revolution. And I said that the marginalist revolution created this thing called neoclassical economics. Now, neoclassical economics, which is the topic of this second module, has some specific differences from that classic political economy. The difference between classical political economy and neoclassical economics resides in two different distinctions. First, neoclassical economists threw away, ejected the labor theory of value that classical political economists had been using. The labor theory of value assumes that something only gets value in an economy if some human does work on it. Imagine you have a field. It doesn't have any value until a farmer plants that field and creates a crop. Then you've made something of value. Human work is the place from which all value emerges. Economists were uncomfortable with that because it allowed politics to get in there. If all human value is created by labor, then it allows workers to try and say, well, we deserve a lot of the money. And really, a lot of the capitalists, of course, that designed the economic system that we have didn't really like that idea, giving labor that much discursive power, so to speak. So they preferred to use an idea called the utility theory of value. The utility theory of value just says something has value if people want it, right? If people find use in it and they want it, it has value. You can make a hammer if you want, but if nobody wants hammers, no one's going to give you any money for it, right? So that labor doesn't matter. So that's a fundamental difference between the two types of economics there. The second major difference is this marginalist thing. And we explained that a little bit in the last module, but this marginalist revolution was kind of a mathematical revolution that made it possible to do a specific type of math, differential calculus, on economic markets so you can find that equilibrium point. Economists really liked that. But those two changes are really the major things that brought about this new neoclassical economics. And that's the type of economics we're going to discuss in this second module. So let's go to neoclassical economics in practice. Okay, so first thing I want to say is that every introductory economics textbook is based on neoclassical economics. It's the most common type of economics of our time. People often just refer to it as mainstream economics. And this is obvious in the two main concepts, supply and demand curves, and also comparative advantage. These are the fundamental things that people take from mainstream economics or neoclassical economics and have become very much popularized. So let's start looking at these theories of supply and demand. Now, if you ever took an introduction to economics course, and I know many of you have, you would have seen a lot of these sorts of graphs. Many of you may not have taken such a course, so I'll take a bit of time to explain what these things mean. Here you have a graph on this vertical axis, up and down. On the left side of the picture here, you have the price. Imagine this is the economic graph for the good. We'll keep going with ice cream cones. So this is for ice cream cones. This is the price of ice cream cones. If you go down to the base here, ice cream cones are $0. If you go up to the top, the price increases. Maybe it's $50 or something up there. I don't know. On this horizontal line, you have the quantity. how many ice cream cones are sold in this market. Again, at the base here, you have 0 sold. And up here, maybe, I don't know, we'll say 50 again. 50 ice cream cones are sold. When you think about that, it's easy to understand why this orange curve, orange line, goes down. It slopes down. This is the demand curve. It's pretty easy to understand. If, say, the price is way up here at the very top, and I would read over to the demand curve, that might be a $25 ice cream cone or something. I can see that if I read over there and then I can read down to see how many people would buy it, hardly anybody, no surprise, wants a $25 ice cream cone. But as the price for ice cream decreases, more people will want to buy the ice cream cone. This is really easy to understand. Of course they would. But how far will that price decrease, and how many more people will increasingly want to buy the ice cream cone? Well, honestly, that just depends on the price. But the price doesn't go down forever. An ice cream cone's price can only go lower and lower according to how much it costs to make an ice cream cone. Producers have to sell that ice cream cone, and if it costs them more to produce the ice cream cone than they can get on the market, well, they're not going to sell it, right? So that's why this blue line, the supply curve, that's the people who make ice cream cones and sell them, who supply the ice cream cones, that goes down. They are willing to supply less ice cream cones at lower prices. That makes sense. If ice cream cones are really expensive, $25 or $50 a cone, lots of people are going to want to get into that business. But if they can only sell ice cream cones for $1, a lot less people want to get into that business, and a lot less people can even turn a profit with that business only selling for $1. Through that invisible hand, magical process, this supply and demand curve meet in a middle, and that's your equilibrium point. And according to neoclassical economics, that is the balance point to which this particular market will fall. It'll find an equilibrium point where there's a price over here. I'm going to guess that's $7, and a quantity. They'll sell 20 ice cream cones at $7 in that market, something like that. I made those numbers up, obviously. But the point of neoclassical economics is that is the efficient point, and it naturally gets there. At that price and that quantity for ice cream cones, you have a price and quantity that's determined by the supply curve, how expensive it is to make ice cream cones, and the demand curve, how much people want ice cream cones. And as if by an invisible hand, that market finds its equilibrium price and its equilibrium quantity. And at that point, the economy's firing on all cylinders, so to speak. It is efficient. You get the most output out of your resources, and it happens magically and naturally, right? Now, neoclassical economists have theorized that this happens to individual markets, like those local markets for ice cream cones, for example. But there is also a theory of general equilibrium that has been mathematically shown to be possible, where the entire economy, say, of a country, can be in equilibrium across all the different goods and services and different prices in the same way. We'll talk about that later and see what it takes to be in general equilibrium or even partial equilibrium in a market. But that's the idea, the core idea of neoclassical economics. Another one is comparative advantage, and it's kind of similar, right? It's the idea that there is an optimal point if there is free trade between individuals or between countries. So to understand comparative advantage, let's use this example of between individuals. Imagine there's a doctor who is very good at medicine, but is also very good at baking, and a baker who is okay at baking and not that great at medicine, but he can do a little bit of stuff. The doctor would give up a substantial income in this scenario, which we call an opportunity cost, the thing you have to give up for the thing you're doing. So the doctor would have to give up a substantial income if he decided to bake bread with some of his time instead of doing medicine, because doctors get paid a lot more. They're more valuable to the economy, right, than bakers. So it makes sense for the doctor to go ahead and do doctoring and then just buy bread from the baker, even though the doctor is better at making bread than the baker is. His resources, his doctoring, is more useful being a doctor than being a baker. So he should only practice medicine and trade with the baker for bread. That baker has a job in that case because he's not as good at medicine as the doctor is. So his job is to let the doctor do the medicine and just to bake the bread. It's not as good bread as you'd have if you let the doctors bake the bread. But hey, you'd have less doctors then, right? And that is a Pareto efficient point. Just like this middle equilibrium in this supply and demand curve is thought to be Pareto efficient, so is trade between individuals who are specializing. That's the theory of comparative advantage. It's probably even more famous when it's spoken about between countries or nations. So this theory of comparative advantage, similarly to the doctor and the baker example, says that each country should focus on the good that they're best at producing, the good that has the lowest opportunity cost. And then trade should be free between people. It should be uninhibited by taxes, tariffs, and quotas and things like that. And then in perfect markets, it should achieve a state of a Pareto optimality, the efficient state, where all of the resources are used at the best way they possibly could be used. Another core idea of neoclassical economics, comparative advantage. I want to give you some examples more specifically of this relationship between supply and demand and how the market is shown to adjust in neoclassical economics. These are kind of things you see a lot in intro economics courses, and you do a lot of multiple choice questions based on them and things like that. The first example is taking kind of a steady state situation that we saw in the last slide and wondering what would happen if demand or supply moved. Something got more popular or less popular in the economy, for example. And the postulate I hope you notice in neoclassical economics is that it always finds a new equilibrium. It's about that balance all of the time. So as an example, let's look at this. Here's our original state. Again, this is the price, just as in the last graph we looked at, and the quantity. Price goes up as we go up to the north, and quantity goes up as we go over to the east here. Our first state is where this D1, that's just demand 1. So this green demand curve is in this position. That's how many people want this good or service. We'll call it ice cream again. How many of them want this ice cream at a given price? And then, of course, our supply curve comes down in the other direction. How much suppliers can supply at any given price. They can supply a lot less at lower prices, but if the price is really high, suppliers can sell a lot more, can supply a lot more of that good. So the equilibrium price here is where supply and demand intersect, and again, it naturally is presumed to find that spot. But imagine all of the sudden, there's a news story in the ice cream market about how they found a tainted ice cream cone somewhere. All of a sudden, people don't want ice cream very much. So what happens? Demand decreases. And economists depict that as a shift to the left of this demand curve. Total amount demand decreases. And as you can see, as that demand curve shifts from demand curve 1 to demand curve 2, it will go to a new equilibrium point. And at that point, I hope you can read over, the price will be lower and the quantity will be lower. Less people want to buy ice cream cones, so the price of ice cream cones will go down. And the amount of ice cream cones sold will go down. And all markets are presumed to work like this. And you see stories in the news, for example, with property, housing markets and things like that. Oh, demand for housing is down, so we're expecting the price to go down. This is the intuition behind that as well. Another example is what if something gets more popular, right? That is usually depicted as demand shifting to the right. So in this case, your D1, your first position, is this green line here. And then you have an equilibrium point in the middle where supply equals demand here in scenario 2. But all of the sudden, I don't know, some famous celebrity is shown eating an ice cream cone somewhere. And everybody's like, yeah, I want to eat ice cream cones too. So demand for ice cream cones increases. That shift is shown by economists as a shift in the demand curve to the right. There's an increase in demand for ice cream cones. The market will find naturally a new equilibrium price and quantity demanded. So that it will be a higher price because demand has increased and a higher quantity. So people will want more ice cream cones. You can do the same thing with supply shifts. For example, here is the demand curve in this third example stays in the same place, but the supply gets reduced. Maybe we're talking about avocados here. Let's talk about avocados. There's a certain demand for avocados and a certain amount are supplied, but a hurricane hits Central America and the avocado crop is devastated. There are less avocados on the market. Economists show that as a shift to the left in a supply curve. And that will lead to a new equilibrium price. And if you read it over, the differences between this, the demand will reduce. There will be less avocados sold. Well, that's obvious. There are less avocados in the world, right? Because that hurricane took them out. But they will sell at a higher price because there's more people trying to buy those fewer avocados. And you can do the same thing for increase in supply. Maybe there's a new technology. This last picture shows an increase in supply. A new technology in avocado harvesting makes more avocados come onto the market than ever before. Suddenly, producers are able to produce more. That's depicted by economists as a shift in the supply curve to the right. That results in a new equilibrium point where the price is lower because there's more supply on the market, but there's more avocados on the market just because suppliers are also able to produce more. So that's the intuition of that market self-regulation as it tries to achieve the market magically its Pareto optimality. Here's an important concept in neoclassical economics, and we've already talked about it a few times, but we haven't explained exactly what it means. The term Pareto optimality, often associated with Pareto efficiency, because optimality does imply efficiency in neoclassical economics. Pareto optimality is the most efficient mix of resource use, leading to an efficient economy. But it's difficult to know what that means. The usual definition of Pareto optimality is this. It's a state in which no one person can be made better off without making another one worse off. Now, that's kind of abstract right now. So to understand Pareto optimality, it's better to use, I think, an example. So let's do this. Let's imagine we have an economy and it's just me and you. And we only have two goods in the economy, two resources, we'll call it, cookies and carrots. That's our total resources in our economy. Now, it happens that I love cookies and you love carrots, but you only sort of love cookies or sort of like cookies, and I only sort of like carrots. So I love cookies the most, carrots a little less. You love carrots the most, cookies a little less. Let's look at our economy. Here is our entire economy. We have 3 cookies and 3 carrots in our economy. And this is what I have. I have 2 carrots. I have 2 cookies and a carrot. And look at that. You have a cookie and 2 carrots. The economists would say this is actually a situation, given on how much we each like cookies and carrots, this is a situation that is not Pareto optimal. Why? Because a person could be made better off in this scenario while not making another person worse off. What could happen? Well, imagine we're locked in a room. I have my cookies and my carrot, and you have your carrots and your cookie. And we talk. And I'd say, I really like cookies, but I'm not into carrots. And you'd say, well, I really love carrots, but not so into cookies. What would we say in a free economy? We'd say, well, let's trade. I'll trade you a cookie for a carrot. If we trade each of us that cookie for the carrot, we'll end up with this situation, which is Pareto optimal. I have 3 cookies. I love cookies. You have 3 carrots. You love carrots. That's better because we've made you better off because you would prefer a carrot over that cookie you had. And we've made me better off too because I prefer the cookie over the carrot. So that's a simple a diagram, I guess, of what economists mean when they say Pareto optimal. But there's more to it. For example, this is also Pareto optimal. Look at this scenario. I have 7 cookies, and I love cookies. You have 1 carrot, and you love carrots. That's optimal, and we can't improve on that according to the law of Pareto optimality. You might say, well, I want a cookie, and it seems only fair that I shouldn't just have 1 carrot when you have 7 cookies. So you should give me a cookie. That would not be Pareto optimal. Why? I would make you better off by giving you a cookie, clearly. But I'd be making myself worse off, and we can't do that according to the law of Pareto optimality because no one person can be made better off without making another person worse off. So, sorry, you can't have a cookie. I didn't make the rules. It's neoclassical economics. Let's make that more clear, all of this optimality, by adding a few simple numbers to it. Okay, so let's imagine our economy is measured in this currency called happies, right? And of course, in our total economy, we want the most happies that our economy can produce. So imagine that I get 10 happies from each cookie, but you only get 5 happies from a cookie because you only sort of like cookies. And we'll assume the reverse for carrots. You get 10 happies for carrots because you love carrots, but you only get 5 happies when you eat a cookie because you only sort of like cookies. Let's put numbers to these different scenarios. The first situation that was not Pareto optimal, you'll see that the total output of that economy is 50 happies. Okay, I've got 20 happies from my cookie, 2 times 10, and 5 happies from my carrot, that's 25, and you get 20 happies from your carrots, 2 times 10, and an additional 5 happies from the cookie, that's 25, that adds up to 50. Our entire economy is producing 50 happies. But of course, that's not Pareto optimal. We know that we could have a more efficient economy than that if we just trade. So in the second scenario, we've traded. It's true. That adds up to 60 happies, right? I get 10 each for my cookies. You get 10 each for your carrots. That's 60 happies. Look at that. The Pareto optimal solution made the more efficient economy. Let's look at our third example. 80 happies. Good. And imagine then that we decided, okay, this doesn't look fair, so we should trade. At least give me a cookie. Or I should at least give you a cookie, right? So let's see what happens. I've taken one of my cookies away. We're going to rewrite how many happies there are. And I've added a cookie to you. Uh-oh, we're left not with 80 happies, but now we only have 75 happies because we've taken 10 happies away from me. That's how much I got from a cookie. And given 5 happies to you because that's how much a cookie makes you happy. So now we actually have less total output in the economy. It's not Pareto optimal any longer. Let's see what we can take from this. An important lesson here is neither Pareto optimality or neoclassical economics are concerned with fairness. And in an intro class, and any economist will tell you, when we're talking about optimality and efficiency, we're not talking about fairness. That's a whole separate discussion. And an economist might really like fairness and think that that's an important discussion to have. But this isn't the time when you're doing neoclassical economics in an intro course. We're only discussing efficiency, really. It also assumes that there is a cost to redistribution, and that redistribution is always bad if it's involuntary. That is, if the people just can't find a deal amongst themselves, it's always bad and it's always inefficient. We saw that with our last example, when we were getting 80 happies, and maybe a meddlesome government went in there and said, well, we're going to give the poor person with only one carrot one of the cookies. We saw, oh no, that makes the economy inefficient. And there is an assumption almost always in these examples of Pareto optimality that any redistribution like that will be inefficient somehow. It'll slow down the economy, make everybody in total a little bit worse off. That's part of the definition of Pareto optimality. And if you notice in that definition, it also has a conservative tint to it. I don't mean conservative according to any particular political party. I mean wanting things to stay the way they are. That's the definition of conservative. You want things to stay the way that they are. Everybody keeps what they already have. That's in the definition, right? Because you cannot... according to the law of Pareto optimality, you cannot make one person worse off. That's it. So you can't take from somebody else, even if it even improves the life of other people. Even if there is no economic cost, you cannot take something from someone and give it to someone else. For example, imagine in our last scenario, if we both valued carrots and cookies the same, we both got 10 happies from a carrot, 10 happies from a cookie. We love them equally, right? So in our economy, initially, there were 80 happies. You could take a cookie from me and give it to you, and we would still have 80 happies. Our economy would still be efficient. It would be still running on full steam, 80 happies. The very definition of Pareto optimality, though, says that's not good. Don't do that. It is bad. It's an ethical position. It's not based on efficiency at all. It's ethical. It says, don't make one person worse off. End of story. Even if it makes somebody better off, without costing the overall economy as far as efficiency. Imagine this. What if you like cookies and carrots the same amount? What if a carrot makes you 15 happies, and a cookie also makes you 15 happies, but I only get 10 from each of those? In that scenario, I could give you a cookie, and that would increase the happiness output of the economy, in this case, by 5. The economy would be a higher output economy. It would now be making 85 happies. That, according to the law of Pareto optimality, would not be Pareto optimal because you've taken something away from something. So in the interest of equality, you can also increase the output of an economy theoretically, but that is a no-go zone for neoclassical economics. So that's an interesting kind of ethical idea that's embedded in the definition of Pareto optimality. So mainstream economists, neoclassical economists, assume that Pareto optimality is the result of the action of free markets. There are particular conditions applied to this, however, and this is what we're going to look at now. What are the conditions under which markets do create Pareto efficient outcomes? Well, this has actually been proven mathematically that it is possible to have general Pareto efficient function of markets in a very famous paper by Arrow and Dubrow in 1954. The possibility of self-adjusting economies was mathematically proven. The article is called "The Existence of an Equilibrium for a Competitive Economy." Arrow and Dubrow mathematically showed it's possible to reach this situation of Pareto efficiency with with free markets in an economy. But as they and many other economists have pointed out since then, there are very specific conditions that are necessary for an economy to become Pareto efficient, to get to that equilibrium. Let's go through these. One is perfect competition. There must be perfect competition in an economy. What does that mean? There must be many businesses competing. There cannot just be one business that's selling you one good, a monopoly, that's called, of course, or a few businesses selling you that good, an oligopoly, that's called. That can't be the situation. It must be perfect competition with many businesses competing in a market. Otherwise, the math doesn't work out. Pareto efficiency can never be achieved. We can't say that the free market operating is a good system for creating the optimal efficiency outcomes, let alone equity outcomes, if we want to care about that. Another condition that must hold for markets to be possible to possibly find Pareto equilibrium is perfect information. People need to be almost omniscient in their knowledge of the market. Say, if I want to buy a cup of coffee, I have to know in my neighborhood the taste of each of those cups of coffee and how much each of those cups of coffee costs, for example. That's perfect information. If there are subtle differences in the coffee, I should know that. So I either have to have that kind of knowledge, or the price should contain that kind of knowledge. If the coffee is more expensive, it's better quality. If it's less expensive, it's not as good quality. Maybe if it's less expensive, if it's more expensive, it's taking into account more environmental damage that was inflicted in the growing of that coffee and things like that. That sort of knowledge should be always contained in the price. If it's not, markets don't work. You don't get to that Pareto efficient result. There should be no externalities, right? So what do we mean by that? No others should be impacted by the production or consumption other than the buyer and the seller. We should just be exchanging that. But if I'm buying that coffee and the result of that is cumulatively that a rainforest was deforested somewhere in the world and that has increased climate change, well, not only will local people in that country be impacted because they've lost their rainforest, the animals will be impacted, they've lost their rainforests, but all of the world eventually will be impacted because I've contributed more to climate change, and that slows down the economy of the entire world as it is currently. That's called an externality. If that's not included in the price, markets are failing. Economists talk a lot about externalities and market failures, and we'll talk a lot about that in this course. Diminishing marginal returns. Okay. If there are not diminishing marginal returns, the market doesn't work. It doesn't find Pareto equilibrium. What does that mean, though? Well, we've already provided an example in this course of diminishing marginal returns. Remember when I wanted to buy the ice cream cones from the ice cream guy? And I bought the first one on that day, and I ate it. And then the next day, after I ate that, I was like, I could go for another ice cream cone, but I liked it a little less, and the more and more ice cream cones I ate, the less utility, the less happies I got from that ice cream cone. That's diminishing marginal returns. As I eat more ice cream cones, the level of happiness I get from those ice cream cones go down. And also, in the production side, it means there cannot be economies of scale. That means to make your business bigger and bigger and bigger won't make you have extra profits for that money. If either of those don't exist, if there's if there are increasing marginal returns, for example, in consumption, well, the market doesn't work. If there are increasing marginal returns in production, that a bigger factory is better, the market doesn't work. It can't be shown mathematically to find Pareto equilibrium. The thing on the consumption side is that it's looking more and more that a lot of our products that we consume actually have increasing marginal returns, not decreasing marginal returns. For example, alcohol. Turns out the more you drink alcohol, the more you want to drink alcohol. It's an addictive substance. Any drugs mostly are addictive. Cigarettes, of course, addictive. Video games are addictive. The more you play them, the more you want to play them. Social media is designed to be addictive. The more you use social media, you get addicted physically to the dopamine that your body produces while you're doom scrolling. And the more you do that, the more addicted you get. Even something like music is addictive. Remember the first time you heard that song, you were like, oh yeah, that's okay. But once you heard it 10 times, you're like, yeah, that has increasing marginal returns. Sugary foods and fatty foods are addictive. Hamburgers from fast food restaurants, the more you eat that kind of food, the more your body comes to need it and become addicted to it. That's increasing marginal returns, not decreasing. That ice cream cone, actually, if you take it over a year, the more I eat ice cream, the more my body gets used to that extra fat and sugar. That's an addictive substance. The more I want ice cream cones. Many goods, maybe even most goods, are actually addictive. They have increasing marginal returns. It also turns out on the production side that a lot of businesses, maybe most of them, have increasing marginal returns to size. That means they have economies of scale. Having a bigger company will be more profitable than having a smaller one. All of these things violate markets. It is impossible to get to Pareto efficiency within those states. There should be no barriers of entry into markets for producers, or you can't show Pareto efficiency mathematically. What does that mean? If, say, it's a market for cell phones, for example, and you get a really great idea about cell phones, you should just be able to start your company up. You shouldn't have to spend a lot of money on a factory or advertising. Your company should just be able to enter the market and compete with Apple. Well, we know there are pretty strong barriers of entry, and it's pretty hard to become large enough. It takes a lot of investment to compete with Apple, for example. There must be consumer sovereignty for Pareto efficiency to work mathematically. What does that mean? Consumers' preferences cannot be changed by other people or by advertising. But we have thousands of studies now showing how people's preferences are changed by advertising. And we have thousands of studies showing how people buy what their friends are buying. So they're impacted, their preferences, their likes and dislikes are impacted by the people around them. They're social creatures. But if there is consumer sovereignty, markets will work. The problem is we don't seem to see humans display anything like consumer sovereignty, so that is always violated. It means Pareto efficiency is not possible to achieve mathematically in an economy. Finally, people have to have stable preferences. What does that mean? Your preferences don't change. The things you like and dislike don't change. Of course, we know people do change their preferences throughout their life, and also we know they change their preferences, as we've just discussed, with advertising or when they interact with friends. Now, if any of these conditions for efficient markets do not hold, that means there's a thing called market failure happening. What does that mean? The market is not finding an efficient equilibrium. We can't say that it is Pareto efficient. This is a common term in economics. And it turns out that almost every practicing economist has shown through hundreds of thousands of studies that at least one of these conditions is nearly always violated in all markets. What does that mean? Most economists think that most economies, most markets fail. There is no Pareto efficient point. And most of the research being done in economics is about when they fail, how they fail, what governments can do when markets fail, how to prevent markets from fail, should you have markets if they're just going to fail, etc., etc. That's where the research is being done in economics. It's weird, though, that that's not mentioned in introductory textbooks. Don't believe me? Check this out. Here's a list of every Nobel Prize winning economist from 1970 to 2025. I've gone through their work and put in bright red market failure for those economists whose work assumed market failure or studied how markets do not work in that neoclassical form to create Pareto efficiency. And in green, I've marked those who assumed and studied markets that function and do create that Pareto efficiency within a reasonable amount of time. And if you'll notice, it's almost all red. Almost every Nobel-winning economist has studied markets as they fail, not markets as they function, with the assumption, the connected fact that markets almost always fail. That's kind of the point. So if you look at this, you'll find in introductory economics tests, they describe to you elegantly how markets function to achieve this Pareto optimality, and you study it and do all sorts of questions based on that. But Nobel Prize winning economists almost entirely suggest that markets always fail. Since 1970, only 15% of economists seem to believe that neoclassical efficient markets are possible in any reasonable way. So why is there that disconnect? Here are the main points this far into this module. First, introductory courses in economics really only teach one kind of economics, that's neoclassical economics. While economists don't even seem to believe in this model, they teach it for intro courses. Neoclassical economics is interested only in efficient use of resources as they are already distributed among people. They're not interested in redistributing resources. That's a different topic, according to neoclassical economists. Neoclassical economics is not concerned with fairness or equality. This means Pareto outcomes can be very unequal, and that's fine. It is not concerned with overall output either. Neoclassical economics is not. It is not Pareto efficient to take away from one person, for example, to create even a greater total output in the economy, right? Because it has that in the law of Pareto efficiency, Pareto optimality, that you must not make one person worse off in order to do something else in the economy. Pareto efficiency is assumed to be the automatic outcome of free market interactions, but this assumes very key specific conditions to even function. First, you have to have perfect competition, you have to have perfect information, you have to have no externalities, you have to have diminishing marginal benefit, you have to have no barriers to entry, you must have consumer sovereignty, and you must have stable preferences. If one of these things do not hold, there cannot be a mathematically provable equilibrium outcome in a market. 85% of economists who have won Nobel Prizes anyway, seem to assume that at least one of these conditions is broken, and therefore there is some sort of market failure occurring in economies. We don't hear about this at all in a normal introductory economics course, though. So why is there a disconnect between intro courses normally and economists in general? Those Nobel Prize winning economists were not a bunch of communists and socialists. Most of them are capitalists, but they're scientists as well, and they're seeing what's going on in markets. Well, the first explanation that's often put out there for this disconnect is complexity. Market failure is really mathematically complex. It's hard to understand and really hard to do math on. So an introductory course in economics is already hard enough. Maybe we should not complicate it by telling everybody the ways that the markets don't work, and first teach people the ways that markets are conceived theoretically to work. Of course, the problem with that is most people only take one course in economics and they never get on to the real world stuff. Another explanation for the disconnect between what's taught in intro economics courses and what economists really believe is ideology. It's in the interest of the wealthy to promote an ideology that discourages redistribution and taxation of wealth. And you can see that in the idea of Pareto optimality, for example. So a question emerges, wow, is economics that's taught at rudimentary levels just ideological? And some people have made that argument.